This is a demonstration of tools for statistical inference on categorical data using Dowker complex and related tools. I'd like to acknowledge a number of people who have helped build out these tools and test them and develop data for them. A number of collaborators from BAE Systems, a few students over the years, some data providers, and of course some funding from DARPA SafeDocs. As an overview, this demonstration shows statistically robust detection of topological features in categorical data. The primary use case is that of classifying parser behaviors that are elicited by various kinds of files. Now, it is format agnostic in the sense that it doesn't care exactly what kind of format you use or exactly what the parsers do. The data are rather sharply summarized in terms of Boolean features that are collected against a number of files. Each file is tested for the presence or absence of each feature. The data are preferentially stored in a sparse format, although if the data come in as a full format, that's not a problem. And by sparse format, I mean the data are provided as a table that has a column that lists the observations and a column that lists the features, and potentially various other kinds of columns that will be discussed as we get there. The capabilities that I'm going to demonstrate are anomaly and misclassification detection, some unsupervised clustering of behaviors across observations, and in fact also across subsets of those observations in particular ways, as well as the ability to compare different kinds of data sets to tell whether or not they're capturing the same classes of features. All of the tools that are shown are accessible as an R library using the R statistical programming language. This is written primarily using the tidyverse dialect of the R programming language. And there are a number of tools and libraries that need to be brought in for data import and visualization, but are not necessary for the overall computations. In addition, the tool that allows you to compare data sets is actually written in Python, but that is accessible within R using the Rticulate library. So to show you how that works, let's flip over to an RStudio session and load in these libraries. So here we are in the RStudio environment. It's a fairly typical IDE. We'll load the libraries that are necessary for this. This takes a few moments. And then we'll load the tools themselves, which is in a separate R library. Now, it's perhaps worth making a bit of an apology for Rtidyverse. If you're not familiar with the R language, and it is indeed a rather niche language, common amongst statistical analysts, Rtidyverse is a weakly typed, lazily evaluated, heavily vectorized, mostly functional language for tables with named columns that also supports metaprogramming. It's a fairly capable language and also interops very cleanly with Python, Matlab, C++, Fortran, and various others. In the computing languages community, it's mocked, perhaps not unfairly, because it can be very wasteful of memory, and it penalizes non-vectorized code rather heavily. And some of the data structures, when traversed even in an apparently vectorized format, are not internally. The function call overhead can be rather severe, and largely that's because of the support for metaprogramming is all done at interpretation time, not at compile time. The syntax for R is also subject to mockery. It is a bit old and has grown organically to be rather complicated. You might say it is rather Baroque. Yeah, that's probably the nicest way to say it in some cases. That said, one of the nicest things that is true about Rtidyverse is that being a mostly functional language, function composition is the way to go. And like Haskell, there is some nice syntactic sugar for function composition. Like Haskell, it associates to the left. But unlike Haskell, it curries a little differently, as will become apparent. The library that I'm presenting uses the convention that test data, if they're present, will be used to start composition pipelines. If absent, various other kinds of data can be used to start the composition pipelines. And training data, if they're present, end up being parameters. So they effectively get curried, or at least morally get curried, although, again, because R is lazily evaluated and interpreted, that's, well, dubious whether you want to call it truly currying or not. I'll leave that to your judgment. Now, the workflow for this particular demonstration involves a variety of tools and a variety of analysis. They start out with some data collected, features against observations. In this particular case, I'm going to demonstrate files that are all of the NITF file format, which is an imagery file format, for which there are a variety of parsers that can be set up to collect a variety of features. There's some amount of data cleaning that needs to be done, and there's a variety of data sets, and what this produces is what you might call a relation or error matrix. These are the tables that I spoke of earlier. That's the jumping off point for most of the analyses that show up on this slide, and I'll use this flow diagram to help keep from getting disoriented as we move through the different tasks. So let's start with data preparation and import, so-called data cleaning. The techniques described in here are described in detail at the attached reference, if you're interested. And our data cleaning requirements are probably best stated in terms of the kinds of tables that the tools consume. They consume a single table or possibly two tables, one for training and one for test, that consist of a bunch of columns, columns that specify observations. For instance, if you're looking at files, they could be some kind of file name, or perhaps a full path, or perhaps just an index into the data. This particular table contains all three, and that's just fine. You also need some kind of features. Perhaps these are parsers, as listed here, or perhaps they are message regular expressions, or other sorts of things. And an optional thing that you might want is some kind of dialect within your data set, if you happen to know what that is. Perhaps that's listed here as a subcorpus. It's worth noting that the column names are largely up to you, the programmer. The tools will accept your choice of column names. You just merely need to say what they are. Now, as everyone knows, data cleaning code is not pretty. The less said about this, the better. So over in our R session, let's just sort of run through all of this and let it do its thing. You'll notice there's some JSON that's getting brought in and a variety of other sorts of things, but good enough. The data are now loaded, and you can see it takes a very little time to load a very large number of observations. You can see that there's a variety of names. About 2,000 files are involved. That if we look at, say, for instance, this data set here, very much like what was specified on the slide, we have features which are, in this case, are regular expressions. There's a file index, file name, file path, as well as some subcorpus information, and actually another file index as well that allows cross-correlation with other data sets. In play, I have actually two different data sets that I'll be using throughout this demo. One that involves regular expressions collected by BAE systems, and another that involves a listing of various kinds of parsers and which files crashed which parsers. They're generally called bug 1 through bug 7. These are two different data sets that have different kinds of features in them, but one would hope, since they're largely the same files, and they can be joined, that you will see some similarity between them. That will become apparent to some extent as we proceed through the demo. But the point of the matter is that the data are now loaded in as tables ready for use. Okay, if we go ahead and summarize the data just so you can have a feel for what's present, inside the data there are, as I mentioned, a variety of files. Those are the columns in these two matrix plots. The color, the brightness, tells you roughly the number of files that exhibit either a crash in a particular parser on the left or exhibit a particular regular expression on its standard output on the right. As you might imagine, You could use, instead of files, any other kinds of observations with Boolean features. From this point on, the analysis is completely agnostic to what your data happen to be. I will use the terminology relation matrix or error matrix, but you should imagine that's to be taken somewhat loosely. The term error matrix is largely because we're involving crashing different parsers or producing error messages. But technically, these are relations between two different finite sets. Or if you have a formal concept analysis background, these are formal contexts. This kind of plot is very easily generated from the R code. Just to show you how that works, that we use the standard tidyverse ggplot tools. So for instance, that is the BAE regular expressions plot. So here's the data being starting out a pipeline and being thread into the plotting tool, which is called ggplot, and picking out the different features we're interested in. I've done a bit of cleanup, providing some nice labels, which could be helpful or not, as is your choice. Here's the other plot as well. A nice visualization for any kind of numerical tabular data is a principal components analysis. As I generally tell any of my students who are interested in working with this kind of data, if you see a feature that jumps out at you in principal components analysis, it's probably really there. If you don't see anything jump out at you with principal components analysis, that does not mean that there's features missing, but you may have to dig a bit further. Principal components analysis is included as a standard part of R. All I've done is written a wrapper to make the data tables that we've been going to be using throughout this demo in a convenient form. Okay, how does that work? Well, you thread the data into a PCA generator function. You identify the column names that are involved, so file and regex are the observations and features, and the dialects are subcorpuses. There's also a feature values tag because the data could be stored in a sparse format. If you want to plot everything, you certainly can, although you can cap the number of points to get plotted. This uses the Plotly library, which gives you a nice 3D plot. So to show you that in action, let me go ahead and run the crashes version. You can see there's the Plotly call. And here it is. You can see a nice three-dimensional visualization. You can zoom and pan and all those other sorts of things, take snapshots as you might like. And the different subcorpuses, which are where the files came from, are color-coded. So you can kind of see that the instigator ones, whatever that happens to mean, are neatly clustered here, whereas the TNG, not so well clustered. Okay, you can do the same sort of thing for the BAE data. There's a lot more features for the BAE data, and as such, the clusters are a bit more spread out. You can see that there is some apparent structure present in the data, and perhaps that's worth examining. And you can see that, again, there is some clustering based on color, but not necessarily. Worthy of further analysis in any case. And those of you who have worked on the SafeDocs project for a while will know that sometimes these PCA plots turn out to be very insightful because they allow you to zero in on certain clusters of behavior. The next stop on our functional tour is a way to compare data sets. So in particular, you might want to know how similar are these parser crashes to the regular expressions captured from a variety of other parsers. Do they capture similar behavioral features? And on what file sources are they most similar and most different? For this purpose, there is a nice metric that you can write that allows you to compare relations. There are metrics on these relation matrices under certain kinds of criteria. The theoretical properties as well as some of the computational aspects are discussed in the preprint that's shown here on the screen. And there is some code that implements a fast approximate bound that the paper describes. It's written in Python, but it's easily accessible within R using the reticulate library. The import call that's being made here, it brings in that Python library. And then at that point, the distance bound works as you might imagine a metric would work. It takes in two different matrices and spits out a numerical value that tells you how far apart they are. I'll show you the output right here. The output from this, after a bit of processing and cleanup code, which we'll see in a moment, is the distance between respective subcorpuses. So I'm going to fix a subcorpus and then compare the crash data set with the BAE regex data set. And larger relative distance means that you're seeing differences in behavior on that particular subcorpus. So for instance, the mutator set, the two sets of behavior are relatively similar. Whereas the instigator is doing a really good job of eliciting differences between the crashes versus the regexes, and as is JITIC Wayback as well. This is merely a statistical observation. It's not really telling you why exactly that is, but this is a good cue. If you're interested in eliciting differences in behavior, perhaps you should focus your attention on instigator and on the Wayback corpus. And in fact, before we run the code, you can almost see that right in the PCA plot. The instigator data versus some of the others is, well, it's kind of hard to see in there because it's kind of a little bit spread out. In fact, the instigator on this plot is pink. There's a pink pixel here, and there's one right even in there, which is kind of hard to click on. So it's very widely dispersed on the PCA plot. Okay, so as I noted, in order to use this Python library, we need to import it into R. Great. And then I have a for loop that walks over each of these subcorpus pairs, collects out some candidate subsamples, collects them up, builds subsample matrices. This is a little bit of work, but not too much. This is because of the way that the Python code wants it processed. And then at that point, it's just simply, there's the call that I had on the slide. It's buried within something that does some renaming and recording in a nice way, and aggregating the results into a nice table. After all that's done running, we have a nice table to look at. Let me show you that table before we get any further. That nice table is right here. And so you can see this is the various different subcorpuses, and this is the distance bound as computed in the paper. And I've normalized those distances for you. Okay, and the plotting code at this point is very easy, and there's the plot that was advertised. The next stop on our tour is the first statistical classifier. This first classifier is fairly coarse. It does classification based on the subcorpus again, with the idea that when you condition on a subcorpus as an entirety, the messages or the features ought to be independent. So it's a kind of conditional independence criterion. And then using this conditional probability, you can play off the conditional probabilities if you have a test data set to identify whether or not that test data set probably came from one or another of the various subcorpuses. The details of how this works mathematically and operationally are discussed in the link on the slide. The general idea that we'll show in the demonstration is that suppose I have a NIDA file source, which is defined by the subcorpus column in our data. Think of that as a dialect. And the slogan is that files from different sources probably exhibit different behaviors when parsed. This may or may not be true, depending on how the sources were collected. So it's worth checking to see if this is the case. Roughly speaking, the call is basically as simple as take your training data set that includes the dialects delineated and thread that into the Bernoulli table function. call out the different column names that are involved. This is because this is a general function that isn't specific to files and regexes. It can work with files and parsers as well, or various other kinds of categorical data. It's a general function. Once you have that in hand, then you can thread your test set through, and it will give you a variety of likelihoods that your test data rows, the observations, came from the given dialects. So after a bit of summarization, you can get some accuracy results. This is a bit of a hokey example because I've made the test set and the training set the same thing. They really ideally ought to be different. When we've run evaluation exercises, of course, the training set was given to us beforehand and the test set was withheld. This is how the code could be used. And the summary table here, the way that it works is it says, suppose I detected that a given file behavior looked like it was from Galois. Well, was it indeed? Well, in this case here, no surprise because my test and my training are the same. I get 100% accuracy. Mutator is the only one that gives a bit less. I guess mutator's a little different. All right, let's see how that works in the code. So in the code, just as I said, it's very simple. We can just run that exact line as I gave you. It takes a few moments to process as it is gathering up and working through each of the different probabilities. This is also a case where the nested structure of our tables is very nice and expressive. On the other hand, there is some function call overhead here. So if you want to do very, very large data sets, this R library, which is fairly general, is probably too general. And you take a performance hit. Okay, that completed, and we can build that same summary table. There is an awful lot of R code that is necessary to summarize this. Apologies for that. It's a little crufty, but it does basically what you would imagine it does. It reorganizes the data. That's the pivot longer. Does some grouping, some joining, cleaning up, and whatnot, and tabulation, and ultimately ends up with a very standard performance kind of score. Okay, same kind of thing can be run for the BAE regexes. You'll notice the code looks exactly analogous. No shock at all. Again, takes a few moments to run. Okay, that has completed. FYI, that took about 2 minutes to run, as you can see by the clock time skip there. I just pruned that out of the video. And again, I can run the performance check. You'll notice this was the same performance table from the slide. Get a little bit different results for the BAE regexes. You can see they're a bit more accurate in this particular rendition. We get 99.8% accuracy or minimum, but again, I'm using training as tests, so of course that's cheating. So that should not be much of a shock. Now, the next stop in our demonstration is actually sort of the pivotal insight in this project, that the Dowker complex allows you to organize multivariate categorical statistics in a particularly useful way. In particular, it helps you manage conditional independence when the conditions you want to use can be rather complicated and nested. So in order to do that, the first order of business is actually to build the weighted Dowker complex. This is done by way of a function that I call Dowker nest. The details of this are delineated in the link shown here on the slide. And that link also goes into discussion of another way to get a refined misclassification probability, which we'll discuss in a moment. How do you build the Dowker complex? Well, as you might imagine, now it's about the same as before. Take your data threaded into a special purpose function that is somewhat generic and just merely needs to be told what column names are involved, which columns identify features, which columns identify observations. In this particular case, it's handy to show off the capability that you can use multiple columns. This is one of the, sometimes people say this is an R misfeature. The way that you build lists in R, or actually the way that you build vectors in R, is with the C function. It takes a variable number of arguments. In this case, takes 2 and allows you to identify 2 different columns that are going to be used to identify observations. What this function does is it collapses your data in a way that each of the various feature patterns and observations that go together are collected. The weight is the number of observations for a given feature pattern. The feature count tells you how many there are. So for instance, on the BAE regexes data, the feature patterns consist of sequences of regexes, hence feature columns equals regex. And so for instance, if I grab this fourth row, for instance, you can see that there are 10 regexes, 10 features. Here they are. That define that feature pattern, and there are 3 different files. That's the weight. 3 different files in this particular data set that exhibit this feature pattern, and here they are. These files numbered 2441 and 2 others. The reason why I wanted to bundle the subcorpus is this little subtable keeps track of the subcorpus as well. So I have the file bundled with the subcorpus, so I can start to ask how the different feature patterns break down versus subcorpus. So this table that's produced by Dowker Nest is a nested table. It is a table of tables, which is kind of convenient for doing downstream processing, although it's hides the data a bit, and so it can be kind of useful for a summary purpose to unnest in a particular way with some summarization. So for instance, I did a count-based summarization and collapsed the feature pattern just into strings. So here is the feature pattern from that same fourth row, and you can see that there are 2 TNG files, noted in green, and 1 mutator file that exhibit this particular feature pattern in the data, and no others. This kind of view is very useful from an analyst standpoint to have an idea about how the data are organized. Okay, you might imagine this takes a while to run, but actually it's nearly instantaneous. So I've created those 2 different Dowker tables. Something I didn't show in the slides, but we've frequently found it useful to get a histogram of weights. That's rather simple R code that does that. And you can get some breakdowns. So here's the table that I was just showing on the slide. Again, unnest and friends does that. And so this is for the crashes. And similarly, here is for the regexes. So you can see the entire table is available if you want to. You can see there's ... more stuff within RStudio. It's very easy to pop open and have a look at all of these in great detail, pop them open, examine them however you might like. It's also very easy to produce CSV files and suck this into some other tool to examine it there. Now, I mentioned the refined misclassification probability called out in the same paper as I just mentioned before. Still very handy, and actually very easy to build. How do you build it? By now it should be the same kind of idea. Take your data set. Now we're actually taking the output of the Dowker nest function, which is this particular data set, and thread it into the Dowker probability function. All you need to do is tell it which column to use for the dialects. So that captures the names of these different sources. And again, after some unnesting and cleanup, you get a table a bit like this. Each entry is a likelihood of that particular dialect or source given that feature pattern. It's very related to the Bernoulli misclassification, but now it's broken out by feature pattern as well. You should notice the sums of the numerical values in each row are all 1. So for instance, you can see this row here has 1 because all of the files are in instigator. So if you see this pattern here, it is highly likely that data set that it came from was the instigator set, for instance. All right, again, running this is nearly instantaneous, and there's the same files, same tables that you saw. Okay, the final capability is unsupervised dialect partitioning. And this is a 2-step process. The reason why it's broken out as a 2-step process is the weighted Dowker graph function takes a good deal to run. It takes a long while, so you often want to save and capture those results so that you can avoid rerunning it. After that, you can do an automated dialect partitioning. You can also look at the Dowker graph itself to identify inconsistent edges. I will not be showing that in this particular demo. But the general idea is there's two calls. You could take the output of the Dowker complex from the previous, again, threading that into either the Dowker graph function, which, as I said, that's slow. Save it off as a new table. And that new table gets threaded into the process that does the dialect partitioning, and that's relatively fast. And again, there's a little bit of tabular output formatting to produce a table that looks like this. Before we delve into the details of how this works, let me comment that this is basically the right half of this table is basically what we've already seen before. You see a feature pattern delineated along with counts of files for each of the different sources. The original is the original counts. But now we have root count and numerical columns. Those numerical columns are all the detected dialects. The idea of this dialect detection is that as you add more features, you presumably should end up with fewer files because the features tend to be uncommon. But that doesn't necessarily happen. And so what you typically want to do is capture some of the root causes, which are feature patterns that are characteristic of a particular dialect. These are the ones for which the root count column is non-empty. And so if you want to know about the characteristic behaviors of each dialect, you look in the root count column. So for instance, the dialect 1 is this bug1 GDAL info feature. You might say, well, rather, that's dialect 5. Dialect 1 is this 100 guy here, bug7 GDAL info. And you might say, actually, I'm sorry, take that back. It isn't that one either. Where is dialect 1's? Here it is. It's the 288 guy. If you find the place where the root count is non-empty and matches the quantity, there it is, GDAL info. My bad. Okay, so the general idea then is that this should correlate to some extent with broad classes of behavior rather than the different sources that we have. So you might look at and say, all right, mutator looks like it's kind of dialect 1, but this 100 indicates no. Dialect 1 is some mashup between the behaviors that are present in instigator and mutator. Which is to say that since these were sources collected by humans, these are behavior classes, and those sources collected by humans pick up a sampling of different kinds of behavioral classes. Okay, we'll look into that a little bit more in a moment. Let me delve into this briefly. As I noted, this is the only place in the demonstration that takes a long time to run. So when you fire off Crash's graph, that can take a long time. In this case, it's fairly quick. I will caution you the BAE graph takes a lot longer to run. But let me just hop through, create the dialects, and then the table that we were just looking at is right here. So this is the same table that was on the slide, and you can see there's more columns that if you wanted to see that, you could pop that open and examine it from the environment over here. Okay, let's do the deed and run this big long one. I'll time it. All right, that took about a minute to run. And at this point, everything else is fast, so we can go extract the dialects as before, and summarize them into a nice table. This is the analogous table. You can see it looks a little different than the other table, although dialect 1 does indeed have a few largish collections of files within it. And so now as sort of a postlude on this, you might ask, how well do the sources correlate with the dialects? Again, the sources are human collected, the dialects are auto-detected. Are they the same thing? Well, no. Some of the sources are spread across several dialects, and some of the dialects are spread across the same sources. And you can compute the probability that a file from a given source will fall in a given dialect. It's actually kind of difficult to do the opposite for technical reasons. But you can look at this plot, and the detected dialects are the columns, the detected sources are the rows. This is for the crashes data. I build the same kind of thing for the BAE regexes data. The brighter colors are higher probability. And you can kind of see this sort of plaid structure, which indicates that there's some spreading. So you can conclude from this that the Bernoullian Dowker likelihoods indicate that the sources and message patterns or parsers isolate distinct file behaviors. But on the other hand, the dialect detection identifies common behaviors across these sources. And the sources do not sample all the behaviors evenly. Again, certain people were involved in trying to create specific behaviors with their sources. On the other hand, some of those behaviors are common across all of them, and some of the behaviors are very underrepresented in our data. So, for instance, the behaviors exhibited by Dialect 2 really can only be found in the instigator set, and similarly for 6 and 7. So these are perhaps files that are worth further investigation. I can very briefly show you the R code for this. It's actually a bit complicated because the probability computation involves hypergeometric functions. There they are. And so it requires a bit of fancy footwork to organize the data. And similarly, here's the same plot for the BAE data as well. And again, you can see the same kind of plaid-ish pattern where there are a number of dialects that are simply not well represented in our data. So that'll wrap it up. This contains just a bunch of links to the papers that were mentioned, as well as links to where the software will ultimately be available if you are interested in using these tools.